Welcome everyone to our office hours for this month. We're going to have a bunch of questions from around the world. We'll be starting off with Aurora from the United States, and then Taryn from Singapore and Con from Australia. So that's who's up next. Here's a preview of our questions for today. We have questions about how do you become a general manager or prepare yourself to be a C-level officer in a company. So we had a couple questions around that, which we'll tackle pretty quickly. How do you build sort of formal mentorship relationships? How do you develop sort of a long-term career strategy? How do you get feedback when a manager isn't accustomed to giving you feedback? And how do you start in a new role when you maybe haven't been in a new role in quite some time? So that's a sneak preview of what we have in store for today. Quick welcome to people from around the world. We'll have live members and several listening into the recordings later from Algeria. I remember seeing that on the list for some time. Czech Republic, Ecuador, Lebanon, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Sweden, Slovenia, the United Arab Emirates, and the Ukraine. So welcome wherever you are in the world. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. The questions I answer are chosen to do a couple things. One is to address a topic I think is broadly applicable to usually at least half of the audience. So most people will ask their question. I might rephrase the question in more of a generic kind of way to sort of highlight the applicability to others. And so that way I can answer an individual person's question and also provide some insight on certain kinds of problems and challenges you either have faced, will face somewhere in your career path. And it's useful to build up a mental database of typical problems on the path that you're pursuing, as well as sort of useful solutions that have worked for other people. So that's the mental database I try to develop personally in my own career and what I'm helping you do in your career as well. So pay attention to questions that may not even seem like they're appropriate to you, because quite often, at least every other question or so, usually has some applicability at some point in your career in the next few years. So I encourage you to pay attention, take notes. Let's see. When you ask a question, would love it if you can phrase your question in a very concise, general way that helps explain applicability to others, and then we can dive into the details of your specific situation if necessary. So other than that, I encourage everyone to take notes and to learn, and with that, we'll get started with Aurora in the United States. Aurora, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Well, thank you so much for helping a lot of us along the way with our career pursuits, and just want to let you know that has been very, very helpful.
Good. I'm glad. Thanks you so much. How can I help you today?
Yeah. So my question for today is, how do I ask a person who has been helping me along to be a formal mentor for me, even if I have nothing to offer yet at this moment?
Sure. Now, are you talking about being do you have a formal mentorship program in your company, or this is just sort of acknowledging a relationship that already exists, or they have very little relationship with this particular person in mind that you have in mind?
This is more about a relationship that exists, but we don't work in the same company. We actually work in rival companies.
Okay. Okay. So you want to be careful with the non-disclosures. Separate from that, I find the best mentor relationships sort of develop fairly organically. This notion of being formally my mentor, unless you have a formal mentor program where you are like mandated to pick a mentor, by a certain deadline, I find the formality of being designated mentor, usually it's actually best to just sort of ignore it, to be honest. And most mentors, relationships that work out well, you kind of find after, months or years, like, I think I'm your mentor, or I think you're my mentor. And you just sort of realize that. So is the relationship working well for you?
I think so, yeah. He has been very, very helpful.
Great, okay. So, and is this person more senior than you, or are you more like peers?
Yes, he is.
Great, okay. So
he's more senior, yeah.
So the value a mentor, particularly a mentor that's more senior than you, the value they get from the relationship really is a vicarious experience. And quite often you will remind them of themselves, right? Or they will do something for you that they wish somebody did for them, when they were at your career stage. Or someone did do that for them, and there was no way they could repay that person, so they sort of pay it forward, right?
Okay.
So, in my book, Case Interview Secrets, I thank two people who helped me with my case interview a long time ago. I put them in the acknowledgments of the book. And there's like nothing I can do to help them, to be honest, right? Except thank them many years later for teaching me the case, which I then taught many of you, right? So the best, not reward, but the best thing you can do in that relationship is share your news, especially your good news.
Okay.
So many times people will, get mentorship, you'll get advice. And then as I mentioned, I always wonder, like, well, what happened? Like, did it work? Were you wildly successful? Did you have some kind of stumbling block? And so we can give updates maybe somewhere between, like, certainly at least once a year. But if more often than that, depending on your frequency of interaction, that's always very, very fun because it's like cheering for a team, in sports.
Got it.
So that's, they want to build a cheer, right? And that's like, you're their team. That's the value they get from that.
Okay. So in order to maintain a relationship, you would recommend maybe reaching out to the person and sharing your updates maybe once a year?
Yeah, if not more often. I mentor somebody at Stanford that was very informal. And she sends me usually an update, usually around major transitions, right? So there's no news. I don't hear much, but usually around transition points like got a full-time offer. I heard about that, right? Got the internship offer, heard about that. Did really well in my review, heard about that, that kind of thing. And it is useful to indicate your willingness to help them, right? But recognizing mutually that the likelihood is pretty low, but you always want to offer. If there's anything I can do to help, I can do this, I can do that. And the areas where that's often useful is if there's something that your demographic, age bracket, usually, that is more familiar with than that person would be. That's usually helpful. So, new social media apps that, someone more senior would not have heard of, right? New platforms, what's hot, what are current trends, if that happens to be of relevance to their particular work. If they have kids, then they're, maybe closer to your age, helping them with, suggestions for, networking to understand better colleges, college application help, that kind of stuff can also be very useful.
Okay, that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. Good luck with this. All right, we have up next, we have from Singapore, Irene, and from Australia, we have Khan. Did I pronounce your names correctly, gentlemen?
Yes.
Hi, Victor.
Hi, how are you guys?
Hi, Victor. How you going?
Hi, Taryn, actually. Like Terrence without the C and the E.
Without the C. Say it one more time.
Taryn.
Taryn? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so why don't we have Taryn go first since Singapore. So welcome, Taryn. I'd love to hear your question, and then I'll have Khan ask his question, and I'll answer both of your questions because it's the same answer. So I'm just trying to be efficient here.
All right.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you.
I'm currently head of operations for Singapore and like a Series C-ish startup. I'm aiming for a more broad general manager role soon. So I find that the general manager role tends to require expertise in sales, which I don't get in my current role. So I guess I've got two questions. One, how can I best acquire this expertise in my current role? And two, more importantly, how am I able to signal this in applications to opportunities outside my current company?
All right, so you're in a director level role in operations, head of operations, excuse me, and you want to position yourself for a general manager role, but you lack sales experience. Like, how do you get it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, in a startup, Series C level startup. Great.
Yeah.
Khan, why don't you ask your question?
I think that I have a similar question, but my situation is different. I mean, I've been in my career about 20 years, okay, and finally I took a career break and study executive MBA program at a top school in Australia. Of course, we don't have Harvard or Stanford like US, but a very top school. Okay. And I've gone through a lot of theories, how to develop yourself to become a leader. But theory and practice are very different. And because I come up to a level, quite senior level already, but I noticed that there's some people who become a leader with a certain skill, which seem to be universal, like communication skill, leadership skill, something that you build not through MBA program, but I believe that you can learn. No one was born as a leader. You can learn those skills. But that's why I seek for a conversation with you and other people in our team as well. How they experience in terms of development skills. So in a sense, it's like talents. I mean, how can you build up skills? Okay. I mean, you have so many theories, as you know. I listen to your practical experience as well as anyone else in our team. Okay.
So basically, how do you sort of adopt and learn the practical experiential skills of being a leader or C-level executive beyond the theory, beyond an MBA program.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the general question here is, how do you be a CEO, or how do you be a GM, multifaceted leader, and when you have part of the skill set, but not all of the skill set, which is extremely common. So I'll give you my general theme on that, and then if I've missed something specific to your situation, let me know. So first of all, I'll make the distinction between getting a general manager or CEO role, and I'll just call it a CEO role just for brevity's sake. There's a distinct difference between getting the role and doing well in the role.
Okay.
Right? It is easier to get the role than it is to be good in the role.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So it's important to keep that in mind. And so my answer will be more about how do you be good in the role, because frankly, with my clients, we fire a lot of C-level officers this year because they just weren't good enough to stay in the role, right? So to be good in the role really demands a multifaceted skill set, right? The reason most functional executives don't do a good job at CEO is because they lack the other skills. So you're great at operations, but you're not great at sales. You're great at sales, but you lack technical expertise, right? You're great at finance, but you don't talk to customers. So these gaps. So best practice, there have been two sort of very proven paths to becoming a CEO at the Fortune 500 level. I'll describe the paths and explain why they're useful and what lessons can be learned from that, because it can be applied to different size companies. So the two organizations that produce the most Fortune 500 CEOs are alumni of McKinsey and alumni of General Electric. Okay, those are the two companies historically that produce the most Fortune 500 CEOs. And they have two very different paths to getting there. The McKinsey approach is obviously being a consultant, rising to partner, then working as a line executive in a Fortune 500 company, usually moving around a little bit, and then ascending to CEO. And the reason that experience is very useful is because consulting gives you the skill set to make decisions with a lot of complexity and certainty, which is very useful in that role. And consulting typically gives you a lot of cross-functional breadth, right? So when I was my second year at McKinsey, I had seen more cross-functional breadth than all my clients who had been working 20 to 30 years more than I had, because I'd seen other parts of the business that they hadn't seen in multiple industries. So that's sort of one idea, one approach, which is you develop this breadth, a very strategic level perspective, then you learn sort of the operational side later, and then you become a CEO. The GE model is quite different, and I would actually think is actually probably in many ways superior. What GE does is, historically anyway, is if you are considered a high potential executive or a high potential performer, I think is what I call it, something like that, high potential employee, you are flagged and you're on the org chart as one of the top 300, 1,000, 2,000 people. It's the top 0.5% of the employees at GE. And what they do in their career path is completely opposite and different than every other employee in GE. So if you're marked and designated high potential, what they do is every 2 years, they force you to change jobs. So, Taryn, if you were at GE, you work 2 years of operations, great, you're going in finance next. And you say, wait a minute, I've never worked in finance before. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, that's exactly why you're going to work in finance. And you will struggle, and you will figure it out, and then you'll be decently competent in finance within 2 to 3 years, and then they'll put you in charge of sales, right? And then once you get good at that, they're going to have you do all of that, but in Turkey, and you've never worked in Turkey before, right? Different culture, different language, different customer set, and you're going to struggle. And so the top GE executives, they have typically gone through this struggle cycle probably 15, 20 times in a 30-year career. And so you'll see often like the top 4 executives who are in line to be the next CEO, one becomes the CEO of GE, and then the other 3 become CEO of other Fortune 500 companies. Right? You see that quite often. So that's those two are sort of two different models, both have their value. But the commonality, which can be applied to any size company, is you need a diversified skill set, right? Either operationally or from a decision-making standpoint. Ideally, both. So the path to becoming a CEO versus being a good CEO is quite different. Getting the job is easier. Sometimes you luck into it, you start a company, you get funding, whatever. To be good, you really need to have that cross-functional skill set. You have to find some way to develop that skill that you're missing. So, Taryn, in your case, your perception in your field, in your company is, yeah, the sales experience seems to be the one that you need the most, right?
Yeah.
And then the question becomes like, how do you get it? But the priority is you got to figure out some way to address that skill. There's probably 2 or 3 specific things I suggest in your case. One is sort of more theoretical learning, right? Okay. So you go take sales training, right? And there's a couple out there, and you read sales books, which is what I did. You go to sales training, which I have done. Even go as far as having a part-time sales job, even on the side. Or if you have an opportunity to take over a small sales team, maybe even make a lateral move, those will be all very useful ways to develop that skill. The downside of that is usually you don't get a raise. Sometimes you take a pay cut. Your career acceleration drops because you're not doing what you're best skilled at. You're learning something brand new, but your long-term ability goes up much higher. So there's a huge trade-off there. Candidly, most people don't do it, right? Because if you're manager of operations, it's easier to become a director of operations, right? If you're director of operations, it's easier to become vice president of operations. Doing a lateral move, particularly several lateral moves, you lose time and speed to that role, but you're more qualified to keep the role. Okay? So that's a huge trade-off. Con, in your case, you talked about a lot of transferable skills that sort of are learned experientially. And so let me talk about that a little bit. So sort of 2 or 3 things that CEOs are very good at. One is decision-making. First of all, the CEO role is a deciding role. They don't always do a lot. What they do is they make decisions, and decisions around what opportunities to pursue and which people to assign to which initiatives and projects, right? And holding them accountable. So that's a very generalizable skill set. So that's why you'll see some McKinsey partners, people who have worked in one industry, they switch to a completely different industry, and sometimes they are successful despite no industry experience in the new industry. It's because they have some of these transferable skills. Okay? So learning to manage people, learning to listen to people who are more talented than you in their particular area, being able to ask the right questions to understand conceptually what they're trying to tell you, usually around different trade-off decisions. That's a skill I find a lot of CEOs who are very good at. Okay? So oftentimes a good CEO is sort of like the least experienced person in the room in each of the functional areas being discussed. But they're able to extract the information needed to make a good decision in that process. Other skills are accountability. So being able to delegate, hold somebody accountable, even if you don't have the technical expertise to do that work yourself, you know when someone's missed a deadline, right? That's an important skill. One could know that a good outcome is one that's measurable, right? And maybe the way you measure performance in sales is different than engineering, but there's still some way to measure performance. And when you take on a new role of leading a particular team, the first thing you want to do is how do I measure? How do I know if everyone's done a good job? I need to figure that out very, very early up front. That's a transferable skill. Public speaking is a transferable skill. Interpersonal relationships, particularly with senior stakeholders, executives, employees, partners, clients, also a useful transferable skill. And in those cases, from a career planning standpoint, you want to think about which of those skills do you lack or would you want to work on next, right? So maybe there's 2 or 3 that you identify as, I think I'm missing these skills, I'd like to work on them. And then it's trying to find some opportunity to get that experience. It can be again, supplemented outside the workplace, classes, workshop programs, or it could be volunteering for projects that really are cross-functional in nature, extra work for you, not necessarily in your normal area of focus, but it forces you to do that kind of stuff. One of my favorite ways to develop executives is to put them in charge of cross-functional projects. That's one of the best ways to develop CEO-level skills. So if you're in charge of operations, then maybe volunteer for a customer satisfaction team that involves operations, sales, engineering, finance, right, and customer service. Because no one leader in any of those 4 areas is ideally suited because it's they're all functional leaders. So somebody's got to do it. And that's a great way to work on those transferable skills that cut across various departments. And it's a good way to get educated by people who report to you on this team as they explain why your idea, although it makes sense from a finance perspective, kind of has some problems from a sales point of view. I didn't realize that. So those are sort of a couple of ways of approaching that. For me personally, I've done pretty much all that I've suggested. I've taken beginner level classes in functional areas So when I first went into product management, I didn't know anything. So on my own expense, I went to go take a beginner product management course. And then I managed an entire department in that area because I got the frameworks for like, how do you manage that kind of role? What are the processes? What are the 6 steps? How do you know if you did something wrong? So that conceptual framework was very useful. And then I already had a lot of the transferable skills and I could apply that. So that's sort of an overall approach for how do you become a more diversified executive, general manager, or CEO type. Did I answer both of your questions? Tareen, you're first.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I guess I was, so I think the part about like how do I become a good one, I think that's explained. I was wondering if you had any specific tips on how one would like drop that on your, like which of these is best for putting on your CV? So like, if you're applying elsewhere or like, what's a good way to get that acknowledged?
So I would, so a couple of things. One is if you've done training outside of your functional area, however formal, prestigious or not, do it. If you have taken side jobs or volunteer jobs, right? So be in charge of fundraising for a nonprofit, right? And list your achievements, right? Raise, $1 million, right? Over 3 years. I'm like, wow, you're an ops guy, but you did $1 million in sales part-time on the weekends, right? That's impressive. So try to seek, just the fact that you even bother seeking those out is useful. And then seek out any kind of cross-functional project, particularly if you're trying to demonstrate revenue production that has a revenue benefit to it. Because you sort of get somewhat credited with contributing to that. So you want to see on your resume revenue numbers on your resume or CV, which is not the normal metric associated with your functional area.
Right. Thanks, Victor.
Great. No problem. Thanks, Tareen. Khan, any other final questions before we move on?
I think that's good because I've done exactly what you just mentioned to me, and I was voted as the most transformed leader by my executive MBA group because I show my vulnerabilities and I seek for their feedback. And I think that the one that I lack is I think you mentioned before in one of your email is how to build executive presence and how to build gravitas. Because I come from an Asian background.
Yeah.
I think, and you mentioned very clearly, and you have the same background as well. I work in a Western society, Western corporations, where it's culturally, I was taught by my parents that I didn't show off my skill. I think you wrote very well in your email. So I think that the next step I would do is to join some of the course to build gravitas or executive presence, because I've done exactly what you said. I mean, I left my finance career background. I jumped into strategy. I tried to learn different skills. I adopted, my executive MBA program skills. So I try to build up much broader skills in my finance background. And I think I understand what you said. I've done exactly what you've done. You told me for the last 10 years. So.
Great. Well,
no more questions.
Okay. Keep it up and keep at it. You're heading in the right direction. And the only thing I would say around building gravitas and executive presence, the one skill that's maybe not as obvious to someone who's not in that role yet is the relationship building, right? Okay. You get more gravitas when you take the time to know people, and they will respect you more by the sheer fact that you took energy and time to get to know them better and to learn from them. So that's just one tip on that topic. So thanks, Khan. Thanks, Diana. And thanks for joining us. And up next, we have Yu Hung. Are you in France or China today? I wasn't clear.
I'm in France. So actually I'm from China, but currently I'm working in France. Nice
Okay.
to meet you. Thanks for giving this opportunity.
You're quite welcome. How can I help you?
Yeah, so like to your point, to make my question more generalized. So no matter in like consulting industry or other corporate environment, so no matter for new joiner or for junior, how to really like develop my personal network with other partner or top management, whatever, like if in different department or industry, without maintain current good relationship with my current sponsor, like senior sponsor, without making them feel like betrayed. So what would be your suggestions on that?
Okay, great. And I'll add a little more context for everyone else. So if I may, just some of the notes that you sent me earlier.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So Yuhan, so working in a consulting firm, sort of convey that you'd have the opportunity to work in multiple areas and with multiple clients.
Exactly.
Right? And turns out what you thought the job would be like and what it actually is a little bit different. Okay?
Yeah, exactly.
So the question then, and therefore to generalize it, is what do you do when you thought the job was one thing and that was what was said, but the reality is a little bit different? And how do you try to get that need met without offending anybody in the process?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So a few things. And this will vary a little bit culturally, which is why I asked where you were. You're working for a Chinese company, or you're working for a French company, or vice versa. And we want to get into that now. But there are cultural differences to that a little bit.
Maybe just, sorry to, so
yes.
actually it's for US, like American company in France. So we may have like some Chinese client, but no, yeah.
Great. So I'll give you the Western culture answer, and I don't know the Eastern culture answer, so it's harder for me. So the Western culture answer is, it works best to address issues like this directly and respectfully, right? And so here's how the conversation would go. Most people don't like this idea because it's a very uncomfortable conversation, but the alternative is to like not get what you need, in that job. And to say something like, to your sponsor or senior partner, can I talk to you about a sensitive topic, right? So can I make a time to take a sensitive topic so something's up, okay? That's important. And make an appointment to talk about it so you don't catch them off guard. And saying that, when I joined this company, I was told that I have the opportunity to work with different clients and different industries, and it would be a very diversified experience. And so far, I've really enjoyed my work. I really enjoyed working for you because you're amazing. Start with compliments, it's really helpful. But at the same time, I was sort of just wondering, like, was that an incorrect expectation to have? That was something I was really looking forward to. And as much as I love working with you, I was sort of planning on working with other people even before we started working together, right? So you don't want to ever convey, I dislike you, right? But more like, before I even met you, I had this expectation, and now I have this difference. And I'd love to kind of get your take on that, because that's still an important part of my career plan, is to get some diversity in clients, issues, project types, that kind of thing. And just sort of put it on the table. And you'll get a couple different answers. You'll get, no, we just lied to you, right, in recruiting to get you to join. I mean, they'll be said in a nicer way. Or they'll say, that's if they're honest, right? Another one would be, they'll say, oh, that was totally correct. I'm so sorry, but everyone else has that experience except you. Let's work on a plan. Or they'll say one thing, promise one thing, but not do it.
Okay.
So that's kind of your range. Either, yes, we promised that. No, we haven't done it, but we'll get it to you. Or, no, we never promised that. What you understood is wrong. Or they'll sort of say one thing and never do it. Okay? So the purpose of that conversation is to force clarity over time for you. Right?
Okay.
So if they say, yes, we'll give that to you over the next 6 months, and then they don't do it, you kind of get the signal that you're never going to get it.
Okay.
And then you have to make a hard decision, right? If it was an oversight, right? And they intended to give it to you, but they never did, then you can work on that. And if they actually do, great. And so no matter what happens, it's useful to pin them down essentially as an explicit conversation. So 6 months later, when you have the second conversation, say, hey, remember back, 6 months ago, you said this, but then that never happened. And I just wanted to check in on that.
Okay.
And so a great way is you want to quote people's own words, and then they feel guilty if they don't follow through on their own words.
Okay, I got it. So so maybe because based on your experience previous in McKinsey, perhaps some partners, they decide the project for some consultants. So you, thanks for your answer, kind of answer one part, how to maintain my current relationship with my current senior sponsor. But in the meanwhile, what would be your opinion, kind of developing new relationship with other,
So and this also different culturally. You want some kind of informal opportunity to meet other people, right? That could be peers and other groups. It could be other senior partners. So you have to read the company culture. So if the company culture is, hey, this is against the rules, or at least against the social norms, then you want to disclose your intention up front so it's not misinterpreted, right?
Yeah, okay.
So if it looks like, oh, you're going to quit, if you meeting other partners means you're going to quit my team, then you want to say, hey, I really wanted to meet other people. I'm going to let you know. I'm going to just sort of informally reach out. just to sort of hear other people's experiences and learn from them. I didn't want to sort of send the wrong signal. I'm very happy in this role. I'm really happy working with you. But I also, part of my career plan is to meet other people and learn from them on an informal basis. So I'm going to go reach out to so-and-so, for lunch. I don't know if they will say yes or no, but I'm letting you know in advance I'm going to do that.
Okay, got it. So
Yeah.
like being honest is kind of like one of the best options. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, especially if anything is potentially controversial or subject to misinterpretation. Better to state it up front, right? So an example would be like if you, I'm trying to think of a good example. Never mind. I had some personal examples that don't apply, but basically disclose early is your best friend, particularly if there's any chance it's going to be perceived in the way that you don't want it to be perceived.
Okay, I got it. Okay, that's clear. Thanks, appreciate it.
All right, you're quite welcome. Good luck on this.
Thanks.
All right, up next from the United States, we have Anand. Anand, how are you?
Good, Victor. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Great. Looks like there's a common theme today about getting different kinds of experiences, and mine is probably no different. I would like to expedite my learning, kind of switch teams often at Microsoft. I'm currently a product manager here. What do you think are some of the best practices before making the change in terms of relationship management or career progression before I move around between teams often, especially if I want to go work in this company for the long term? And finally, how long do you think is a good time to stay in a team, irrespective of whether I'm getting the experience right or wrong, to be not perceived as somebody who's just hopping around jobs within the team?
Okay, that's make sure I understand your question. How long should you stay in a role that's sort of respectful of the role and not seen as a job hopper? And how do you delegate? Yeah, how do you sort of? If I understood, so the question you wrote in, how do you go work for other people at some point without pissing off the person you're currently working for, right? Yes. Is that fair? Okay.
Yeah.
So again, very similarly, if you're doing it pretty informally and you're not going to make a major move or career change, then the disclosing isn't really necessary. But if you're pretty sure you want to do a transfer, you're actively looking, and you don't want to burn a bridge, it's, again, like I said earlier, it's useful to be transparent. Say, hey, I've been thinking about, I've been in this role for about 1.5 to 2 years. This company, I think, I know a few folks at Microsoft, there's a lot of internal transfers. So that's a pretty common thing in that company culture, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of there, I want to let you heads up. I'm kind of be looking around, probably, and sort of informally, and I'll probably make a move sometime between 4 to 12 months, just to give you some idea. So in the meantime, I'm still pretty devoted and going to work on everything you've assigned me. I'd love to work on A, B, and C. And the reason that's useful is you give them heads up, right? So they can start thinking about who they might want to backfill into your role. I know you mentioned earlier in private about maybe they don't give you the plum assignment that you really want. But
and the bonus as well.
And the bonus. Okay. Well, that one's harder, right? So do it after bonus season. So like the day after you get your bonus, then announce your intentions. A lot of people do that, including McKinsey Partners, one that I know. And candidly, there are probably some projects you shouldn't be taking on if you'll be transferring out. And if your boss were to give you that project, that would cause them a major headache because they got to undo some things. So realistically, that is a legitimate concern from your manager's point of view. And you disclosing a little bit earlier that your intention to move will change sort of the math, if you would. It's just making math on whether you get that project. And that's probably for everyone's better off interest to do so. So I wouldn't overly worry about that. And you're sort of pretty transparent about what you're intending. Useful to say that, and if I do transfer, I'm going to commit to giving you a month notice, right? You can make agreements like that make it easier for you to get a meatier project because they know you can sort of transition well with a month's time, but maybe not with a week's time. Mm-hmm. So anything like that can be very useful. So it's just useful to have that candid conversation, especially if you're in the kind of company culture or a country culture where that is valued and can be respected.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Up next, we have also Victor from Australia. Victor, how are you?
Hi, good, Victor. How are you?
I'm great.
Thanks for actually inviting me on the panel. I guess my question would be, as a current MBB management consultant, what sort of tactics you can give me to figure out the impact of transitioning out after 1 year of joining?
Got it. So you want to leave a top 3 firm in a year, and sounds like you're a little concerned about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a face value of staying longer from a recruiting perspective. Often they say you have to stay probably like 2 years or 3 years to make you more employable. But on the flip side, I just figure out, this is probably not something I quite feel fit into, or I feel less interesting about. So how can I actually, address that issue, make it more employable? But in the meantime, thinking of transitioning out.
Okay, so you're not the first person to think about that decision. I know many of my former colleagues who've left after a year, so it's not a huge deal. Can I ask, how many months have you been there, if I may ask?
Almost a year, 11.
Almost literally a year. Okay, great. So what you need, so one of two things: either you force yourself to stay to 2 years. 2 years is a more natural transition point for that field. If you want to leave earlier, you just can't take it. Maybe there's pressure that you might not make it to 2 years, which I'm not saying is the case, but sometimes that happens with other people. Then what you need in the transition is a story. They're going to ask, like, why are you leaving in a year? Did you get fired? Are you getting pushed out, right? And the good thing is, because it's a top 3 firm, the resume value of the top 3 is so high, it really outweighs the fact that it's only 1 year, right? So what you do need is a good story that makes sense. And the best story is the one you gave me. Thought it was one thing, just not a good fit for me for A, B, and C reasons, right? And that's why I want to go to join your company or your industry, because A, B, and C is not true in your company. So for example, at McKinsey, we would get a lot of ex-Goldman people who had only worked 1 year, because they were smart, they're brilliant, they're accomplished, but they're not bankers. And they realize, whoa, I am not a banker, right? On the flip side, we've had a lot of McKinsey people go 1 year and then go to Goldman. Like, great people. I like them. I love hanging out with them. I just am not a consultant, right? I am just a banker at heart. So you need a great story around that. And I would say, if you're stressed out about it, I wouldn't. Everyone who left after a year, they all did really interesting things. Most of them quite successful and a lot happier too. It's like, my office mate left after a year, when I was there my first year, and she got a PhD as a professor of social science, at some university. Someone else left. She now gives TED Talks and does now a psychologist. She's quite famous for some of her research. So the people who initially were afraid they'd be sort of the quote unquote the rejects have become extremely successful in a different field that fit them better. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, but just practice your story to explain why, and then explain why the new role would not trigger the same outcome. That would be important. That would be a concern that the recruiter would have.
Great. Thanks for your great advice, Victor.
Okay, great. Good luck on this. Okay,
Thank you.
Take care. All right, next we have a question that was submitted in writing from Switzerland, and I cannot pronounce this person's name, and so I'm going to avoid embarrassing myself, and it's a bit more a sensitive topic, so I'll just leave the name anonymously. So the question is, how do you get actionable feedback from your manager? And specifically in this situation, this person says, my manager is extremely happy with all aspects of my work, internally and with clients, but says that I have to wait 5 more years to gain experience on my resume in order to develop my career. Okay? So the challenge here is you want to get better, and your manager's not telling you, what do I need to be better or to rise to the level of skill needed to get the next promotion. Okay? That would be the general version of the question. So this depends a little bit on company culture. Sometimes your manager doesn't want you to be promoted to the next level because they want you, and their selfish interest is in keeping you in the existing job. So some individuals have that sort of mentality, and some company cultures, have that bias. So it's really important to figure out the mentality of both the individual you're working for and the company and its culture, and whether they whether that's sort of something they value, staying in place rather than progressing. If it is a cultural issue or it is very clear your boss does not want you to move up, then you have to decide whether you want to stay there, and that might change your decision-making process for how long you might stay there. In terms of assuming they are willing to give you feedback, here's how you ask for it. You say, hey, I would really like to develop the skill level between my current role and the next one. So from a director to a VP, let's say. I understand I'm a couple of years away from that. I totally respect that's the process, and perhaps there's not an opening for that. But just from a skill and professional development standpoint, I'd like to get to the next level of skill. I would love to know what is the difference between my skill level as it is today versus this next level. Right? So that would be the first question. What is the difference between me and a CEO, or me and a VP, or me and a director? And what are the specific things I can do to work on, pick one of the areas that you're missing. What is a specific thing I can work on to improve my ability to manage other people, or my ability to communicate with, in terms of public speaking, for example. Basically, the idea is you gently and respectfully be persistent in asking for something concrete you can do. Okay? Now, if the person you're talking to is open to that and has the ability to give you feedback, but maybe needs a little prompting, if you ask persistently, they will give you something to work on. Okay? A lot of managers either can't do that or will not. And that's important for you to know. So it's useful to ask explicitly multiple times. And you either get feedback on what you can do differently, or you get clarity on the reality of your situation. And both are useful for quite different reasons. Personally, I would say if there isn't an obvious next step for you in your career at that company, they're not going to promote you for 5, 6, 7 years. They're not going to help you get better. Personally, that would limit how long I would want to stay in that role, because there is not a path to my goal in that company. Right? So I call that career pathing. And that's an important conversation. If you're a manager or leader and you want to keep your staff, right, it's important to have the career path conversation to make sure that you can keep your staff long term based on what it is they want and need in their career to make it interesting for them. Right? So on both sides of that equation, you want to have that conversation. And if you can't get that information when you're the subordinate talking to your manager, then that probably prompts you to potentially consider leaving earlier than you otherwise would if you can't get feedback and basically they don't want to or won't or aren't able to help you develop your skills. That's kind of my take on that. All right, let's move on. Now we have a question from Philip here in the United States. Philip, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Victor.
Great. How can I help you?
I'd love to understand if the interview process is truly an exercise in selling. And as a follow-up, could you please help advise on developing a framework to understanding what's working and what's not working? For context, this has been the year of interviews for me. I've had about 15 calls with hiring managers and 8 or so on-sites where I've gone in and still haven't yet landed the job.
Okay, great. So this is a difficult one because there's a huge bias amongst hiring managers and human resources professionals to not give you any feedback or not give you any honest feedback. So what I always do when I don't get an outcome I want, whether that's in a job interview, landing a deal, closing a partnership, dating, whatever the context is, right? That's all selling. Or even like parenting my children, right? If I'm not getting the outcome I want, I'm always going to try to ask, hey, what could I have done differently on that one, right? So I'll say to my children, what could I have done differently, right? That would have made that situation better for you. So I would try asking. You may not get an answer. You might get a very generalized answer that cannot get them in any kind of trouble, right? Their concern is if they're too honest, then you become a problem. And so it's better just to be like, oh no, it's like, it was just based on the competitive pool, right? Just wasn't a fit. And it's like, that's not actionable. So given you've had so many sort of outcomes that you haven't wanted, in your particular situation, you might consider, working with an interview coach of some kind and just go through a practice. Maybe there's something that's just sticking out that you can't see, right? Maybe there's something you say that's offensive or rubs people the wrong way. maybe there's a particular experience in your resume that when you explain it, kind of comes across, not in an unintended way. So someone who is sort of in that role can just kind of notice those kind of very general, issues that stick out. I don't sense anything in our interactions that would stick out as a problem, but I think that would be useful since you've gotten some market feedback that what you are selling, they're not buying, right? And what we don't know is, let me back up. To answer your first question, is interviewing a process of selling? Yes, it is, okay? Because it is about conveying what you can do for the other person, and keeping the job is a function of your actual skills. Getting the job is a function of your perceived skills. So your perceived skills is below the threshold to get a job offer, which has no reflection on how well you can do the job. But it does reflect how well you're conveying or how they are perceiving your skill set. Okay? So a few things to look out for. Any anomalies on your resume, sort of long gaps that aren't explained would be something like you'd want to work on a story. Usually you don't get interviews unless the resume is strong enough to convey that you have the chance. So there's something in the communication process that's not connecting well. So there's a disconnect in there somewhere. So that's what I would suggest is either a formal interview coach, or even if you have colleagues and peers, and ask them for a favor. Hey, I know you interview people for jobs. I know it's in a different functional area. Can you just give me a practice interview here and see if there's something I'm doing that's really offensive or coming across the wrong way? Because I'm getting some negative, and I can't figure out what that is. So that's what I would suggest in your case. But it is a selling process, and I think you're doing the right step of when you're not getting the outcome you want, you got to figure out why. And the problem in sales, interviewing specifically, is they're so afraid of like lawsuits and whatnot. They just give you very little honest feedback. But it's consistent enough that I think there must be some consistency there. It's not a company-specific issue, right? So I think calling in a favor, getting some help with somebody else to give you a mock interview, a couple would really help give you some idea of where that concern might be.
Wonderful. Thanks for the practical steps. I
All
appreciate
right. Good luck, Philip, on this one, okay?
Thanks.
Sure. All right. Up next, we have Jamalia. Jamal, how are you?
Good. How about you?
I'm good. How can I help you today?
Absolutely delighted to see you.
Awesome. Great. Likewise.
So I'm transitioning to a new job after a layoff. I've been in my previous role for 12 years.
Okay.
I'm getting a new boss who seems to be super excited to get me, which is always a good sign.
Great.
So, I wanted some advice on management of the boss. It's a new company. It's a new environment. And my boss is telling me that you'd start with 5, but your team will grow to 15 people.
Okay.
So the last team that I built took me around 4 years to get them to kind of, work together, gel and everything. Just needed some practical advice to kind of do it in this new environment and how not to get this wrong.
Okay, great. So the generic version for everyone else is, I got a new role. How do I excel quickly and not screw it up? That's I'm getting from you, right? So a very common problem, and hopefully, if we're all doing our jobs well, you will all be in new roles at some point. So this question, everyone should be writing down, because the only reason you don't get this role is if you stay in the job forever, right? And we always want to be progressing. So a few thoughts. So in my notes, I wrote down 6 things you want to do. Okay, so six things. So for those who take notes, label them 1 through number 6. Number 1 is to build relationships. So meet your staff, meet your boss, meet your peers in other areas, and anyone who either provides an internal service to you that you utilize or is a customer of what you produce. So if I'm marketing, I run marketing, I'm going to talk to the head of sales, because the head of sales consumes my marketing. I help him or her do her job. So I want to know that person, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there is a market research group, and I use their research to develop a marketing campaign. I want to know the head of research. Okay. Right? So wherever you are in the flow, you want someone who's upstream of you and someone who's downstream of you, everyone on your team, and all the peers that get impacted by your work. So just meet them, have coffee, have lunch, whatever. Just get to know them as individuals. So when people say, hey, have you met the new person? Like, oh yeah, we just had coffee like 2 weeks ago. That's the answer you want them to have. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to identify the key issues, sort of like the key issues in your functional area. So issues are both opportunities and headaches.
Okay.
So if you ask your staff, hey, what are the great opportunities we have here on this team? What are the big problems? They're going to tell you, especially the problems. Everyone loves to tell you the problems, right? Mm-hmm. And what you're looking for is convergence, okay. Right? So if your staff says, we have problem X, your peers and other groups that rely on your work say, we also perceive you as having problem X, whatever X is. X could be, we don't know what you do. It could be there's friction, interpersonal friction. It could be the cost-benefit ratio of your department doesn't seem like it's worth it. Whatever that is, there's usually a common theme. So that's number 2. Figure out what the key issues are, because you have to resolve them. Mm-hmm. And you need to know what you're on the hook for in a new role. Mm-hmm. Sooner the better. Step 3 is to identify other people's expectations and their needs. And so I would go, hey, you know, for my staff, like, hey, what are you expecting from me? Like, I want to be a great manager for you. What do you need me to do to be a great manager for you? If I'm working with the head of sales, I'm head of marketing, I would say, hey, I want to be a phenomenal partner to you in sales. What do you need my team to do in order for you 6 months from now to say, wow, I've done a phenomenal job leading that team? What has to happen? So in essence, you're trying to define what success looks like to the various stakeholders that are impacted by what you do. Okay? Hopefully there's convergence. That doesn't always happen. But ideally, you want everyone saying a similar set of things. Okay, I know what I need to aim for these things, 2 or 3 things that everyone's saying is important. Okay? So that helps you figure out what your scope of focus should be. Sure. Number 3 is to develop your own assessments of the situation. So separate from what everyone else thinks, like, what do you think? Given your skill set, your experience, what do you think of your team? That's always a question you need to be answering pretty quickly within the usually first few weeks. Okay. What are your thoughts on the problems and opportunities? What do you want to do, right? So an evaluation. So to your boss, somewhere between, 2 to 6 weeks in, you want to report back to your boss, even if they don't ask for it. Hey, I just want to give you my initial assessment of where I think the team is, right? I have the right team. I have the wrong team, right? I have the right team, but they're too small. It needs to be bigger. The team is focused on the wrong issues. The team is allocated to the correct issues. So sort of big picture, where are things? So those are a very useful feedback to give to the person who hired you. Sure. And that gives them the sense that, you see things pretty accurately, right? Okay. So maybe I've been here 7 years. Maybe I'm your manager. Mm-hmm. I notice these problems. And within 2 weeks, you notice the exact same problems. Okay. Now, you may not be able to solve them. That's to be determined. Mm-hmm. But at least you see the same problems that I see. And that's extremely reassuring to everyone else if you see the same problems that they see. Okay. Okay. So providing some kind of assessment is useful. That's step number 3. Step 4 is develop a plan. Okay. How are you going to pursue the major opportunities? How are you going to solve the big problems getting in the way of you pursuing the major opportunities? Like, what is your plan? Who's going to do it by when? Right? Okay. And then the 6th one is, if you can, and try to get a quick win.
Yes.
So get a quick win, solve some kind of problem that's really annoying to everyone. It's not actually that difficult to do, to give yourself some credibility. Right? So what everyone else is looking at in your first 30 to 90 days is, did we make the right hire or were you a hiring mistake? Okay. Right? So it's really reassuring if you, in that time frame, 1 to 3 months, you solve something that's really irritated everybody else. Okay. Like, finally, finally somebody took care of this, right? We got the right guy, or we got the right gal. So a quick win to build credibility, super important. You don't always get it. And sometimes the headaches they have are more medium and long term. That's fine. It's not an obvious quick win, but if there is, try to get it for your own credibility's sake. It'll make life a lot easier for you. Okay. So those are my 6 things.
Okay, perfect. So, but is the, in terms of you said developing the plan, if I'm able to show a plan that will get us a win, maybe not a quick win, but it seems logically possible to get us there. Is that also acceptable as a good enough solution?
It is, yes, because what you want there, though, is a milestone, a set of milestones to show progress. Okay. So maybe the kind of problems your team has are not ones you can solve in 30 days.
Yes.
It's going to take 4 months to even see any progress because they're very, very big issues, perhaps.
Yes.
What you want to convey to everyone else is like, well, what can you expect by when?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. So if maybe it's like the entire team's wrong. Right? Mm-hmm. They were the right team for where the company was a year ago. Things changed. It's the wrong team. I need to replace all of them. Right? And you will know we're on the right track when I get these 3 roles filled that don't exist today. And my plan is to get that filled within 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
So they need some way to measure progress.
Yes.
And if you were to present a plan to me, I try to poke holes in your plan to see if the rationale made sense. I'd look at your facts and say, how did you arrive? What are you basing your decision on? And are those facts validated? Is the rationale behind that? Does it make sense logically of your plan?
Okay.
And does it pass what I call the reasonableness test?
Okay. All right.
So if your plan, if your facts are accurate, your rationale is reasonable, like, okay, the plan makes sense, I figured you could make a plan. Right? And so I don't worry about that. Now I worry about, can you deliver the plan? And especially if I don't know your work as well as you do, I may not be able to, maybe I'm a CEO and you're a technologist, right? I'm not a coder. I don't know engineering. How am I, as a non-technical person, going to know you've done a good job?
Okay.
Right? We'll have our first release on this date. Like, oh, okay, I can track deadlines. I can do that.
Sure.
So you need to tell them how to measure your progress. And if they're comfortable with that, get their buy-in. So that's the overall process.
Okay, all right. And the second part of my question was on the team. The team that I met very briefly out there during my interview process. My manager told me they have an average of like 25 years of experience.
Yeah,
which is way more than I have.
Sure.
So how do I not screw up with them and slowly build the team along with them?
Yeah. So have you started working there yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, great. So you need let me try to use the expression is you need what I call it, there's an idiomatic expression called a temperature check.
Okay.
Right? You want to sense emotionally how your team feels about you.
Okay.
Right? Do they feel threatened by you? Do they feel excited because you bring a set of skills they really need? Do they feel like you're not qualified because they've worked 20 more years than you have?
Yep.
So it's useful to get some read of that, either personally, directly, or if you can ask your manager, hey, just like, what is the attitude of the team about me coming on board, right? Sometimes, I've been in this situation quite a lot where everyone who reported to me had more skills and more experience in that technical area, but I had better managerial experience or strategic experience or executive level experience. So it is useful if somebody else has more skills than you, it's useful to just acknowledge that.
Okay.
Right? It is also useful to explain like the value you bring that they might not have.
Okay.
Right? Don't pretend. Right? So I had a client who, he was VP of sales. He had 35 years of experience running sales teams.
Okay.
And I had 1 year of work experience at McKinsey. And he was my client. And he's 3 times older than me. I was 21, he was 63. Right? And so I said, Don, like, you got more sales experience than I do, right? So I'm not going to be able to help you there, but I'm really good in other areas, and I know how they fit in, right? So I know, so he got promoted to general manager of that team, of that company rather, unexpectedly, and he was very weak in finance. I say, I can help you understand financial ratios, right? Beyond just getting the deal done. I can understand how the board is going to perceive your plan because I have some experience in sort of evaluating sort of operating plans. And so together, we can help you get what you need to, we can help you accomplish your goals. So that's what's the kind of conversation you want to have with all your major stakeholders. But it's useful to know, are they going to be hostile to you or are they excited to have you on board? That's useful to know before you walk in. And if they're hostile, it's useful to try to figure out why, have an honest conversation. And when they say, hey, I don't understand why I'm reporting to you because I got 20 more years experience than you do. I'm like, in that you're right, you have. But here's what I bring to the table that I think can help, right? And my hope is together we can move the team forward. So that's something useful. And final thing is, was anyone else on the team that reports to you or will report to you, were they applying for the job that you got?
That I don't know.
That would be very useful to know in advance.
Okay.
Right? Because that's an envy issue.
Okay.
That's an emotional intelligence issue that you'll be sensitive to. And there, it's just useful to acknowledge it because it's awkward, right? Mm-hmm. And to just be sort of candid about that and say, and find some way to meet their needs. Like, what is it you want to do? Do you want to learn more? Do you want to develop better skills? I know that you wanted this job, and unfortunately that's not an option. I'm here. But what is it that you do want? How can we work together to make it useful for both of us? I really want you to stay on board. I want you to be excited. I want you to develop your career too. That's important to me. Tell me what you need.
Okay.
And that sort of shifts you from being enemy and threat to ally.
Okay.
Right? That, you want to know that before you walk in, because otherwise you get sort of,
that's great. That's great.
Okay.
Okay, that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Good luck. Congratulations on the opportunity too.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Let's see here. So I got a couple questions that got submitted in writing, and then we'll take a couple live ones as well. So next question is from Corinne from China. And the question is more of a curiosity question, actually. I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask me this question. So the question is directed to me personally. How do you find the topics and concepts that you introduce in emails that you send regularly? What is your methodology to break down each concept into explainable parts while making sense amongst all of them? So where's my phone here? So I have a special email address, and I'll pull it up right here, that I write emails to myself to a special email address for all the ideas I have for articles. I have 232 emails that have been unread, in that special email account, and each email is an article idea. So I've been collecting ideas of things I can write about, for I don't know, 10 years now, I guess. I lose track, and so I basically get ideas throughout the day. Okay. More as a personality, I'm really interested in ideas, so I tend to collect ideas a lot. So an idea might be a particular technique in an industry that's very common in one industry but not in another. An idea might be some insight or some counterintuitive insight that I learned from somebody. So an example might be, a company might say, I have no competitors. There's no one else that does what we do. A useful insight I learned is not to define competitors as other companies that do what you do, but to define competitors as alternatives to buying my product. Right? So if you think of a competition in quotes as alternatives to buying my product, your competition is often status quo, is to buy nothing from nobody, right? So you saw that a lot in 2008 in a major recession. You weren't losing to your competitors, you were losing to people not doing anything and buying from anybody was the major quote unquote competitor. So that's an example of an idea. So I look out for novel ideas. When they seem interesting, I write them down. If they say interesting enough to share, I'll make a note in a special file, essentially my special email inbox, to collect those ideas. So that's how I do it, just gathering ideas as I sort of go through about my daily life. In terms of explaining ideas, one of the things I am really conscious of is trying to find analogies as a way of teaching things. Right? So for example, when I teach the case interview, I might say there's two ways to do a case. And doing a case is an awful lot like cooking. Okay? So cooking is my analogy here. You can follow a recipe exactly as the recipe states, every single instruction, every single amount, very precisely, or you can cook by cooking by taste, right? Not following any recipe, putting the ingredients in there, no measurement of proportions, but then you taste the food every 30 seconds to see if it tastes correctly, right? And so I might say, you start off learning the case by following frameworks because you don't know anything, just like you start following recipes when you're beginning to learn to cook. But you want to graduate to cooking by taste. You want to graduate to doing cases through logic and structure rather than a formal framework. So that's an example of analogy, right? So I like using analogies to teach ideas. when I teach a process. So how do you ride a bicycle, right? I like to break it down into steps, and I like to number the steps. So you'll see in a lot of books I've written, I have either a chapter that explains an idea or a concept, usually has an analogy. I think very carefully about the right analogy that fits, or I have a chapter that teaches a process, and the process always has steps. It's a 5-step process to developing competitive differentiation. It's a 5-step process to how to price a product. It's a 7-step process to how to hire an employee. So those are the 2 ways I write a chapter, and those are often the 2 ways I'll write an article, an email, or otherwise. And so it's my most common way of communicating, is either concepts or process steps. So in a process step, if I'm teaching how to do something, I try to start with the most basic, simplest part of the step and then build up into it. So for example, I taught a friend how to ride a bike recently, a bicycle, and I worked on the easiest steps first that were easiest for the person to learn, and then worked my way up to the hardest step. I find that's a useful progression for learning a physical skill like riding a bicycle, learning an intellectual skill like mathematics. So those are the processes I use. So that's how I do it in terms of gathering ideas and presenting them. All right, so next question, also submitted in writing, is from Luke in Indonesia. And the question Luke asks is, what advice would you give to someone who was about to set up another new business despite having 2 failures in the past? So Luke, what I would say is, welcome to the club. I've had at least 2 failures in the past, if not 3, depending on how you count, but 2 really big ones. The advice I would give is really being very honest with what mistakes you made in the past. Okay? So let me just step back for a second. I like learning ideas from other fields I don't personally work in very much or get much exposure to. One of the ideas or fields I study as a form of cross-training is how does the military manage their teams, for example. And one of the tools I like in the military is called the after-action review. And it is a report and a meeting and then a report written up after every sort of military engagement of what the team did well, what they did poorly, and what they would do differently. In the field of medicine, they have a very similar process. I think it's called the Morbid Mortality Council, M&M, I think is what it's called. And that is when a patient in the hospital dies, they get all the different fields together, all people involved, and they figure out what went wrong and what the team would want to do differently going forward. What did they learn? Right? So I like that process of doing in consulting we call it a post-mortem, right? Like an autopsy, that kind of a thing. So I like that process, and it would be very useful for you or any entrepreneur or anyone who's accomplished anything or is trying to accomplish something but has had a couple of obstacles or failures in the way. You want to be very honest about what you did wrong, what you did well, what did you learn, and what would you do differently. I'll give you an example. I'm doing a lot more work in the emergency management field, just as really as a hobby more than anything else, and a lot of volunteer work. And I started printing up after-action reviews from major disasters here in the United States. And I have one here, and this is an after-action report from a department from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Department. I can't remember what the acronym exactly stands for, but it was the medical team that ran the makeshift hospital that's up at the New Orleans airport after Hurricane Katrina about 10 years ago. It was just fascinating to learn about all the mistakes they made, what went wrong, what they would suggest doing differently. So whenever you've had major setbacks or failures, you've got to do an after-action report process of some kind and be super honest about like what you would do differently. And you want to make sure that you don't repeat mistakes, right? So failures and setbacks are often inevitable. What is preventable is repeating the same mistake twice. You never want to do that. And with every iteration, you get closer and closer to your goal by eliminating mistakes because you've learned from them in the past. So that's the process I use. Many fields do that. I think it's a very useful learning process and would encourage you and all entrepreneurs or anyone trying to accomplish something and having had some setbacks to go through that process and learn from that. All right, up next we have Slater here in the United States. Slater, how are you?
Doing very well, thank you, Victor. How are you?
I'm good.
Excellent, thank you. So, wanted to find out what is the best way for a leader, especially one with a non-technical background, but working in a tech company, or if you want to be specific, like an enterprise software company, able to equip themselves with the skills and understanding to converse and relate to the technical development teams. This is especially significant when the strategic planning, being able to recruit good technical people, and allowing them to have a sense of timelines and capabilities.
Sure. So this goes back to, in many ways, very similar to the question of how do you be a CEO, in the sense that the issue CEOs have is they are in charge of people who have more skills than they do in their area of focus, right? So you have a very similar problem. What you need is, what the skill that CEOs have that a lot of other people don't, is the ability to conceptually learn a technical field of which they lack expertise, enough to make correct trade-off decisions. So if I were to choose, what I would do is you would want essentially someone to teach you like the technical side of the business that you are responsible for, but that you may not know personally, right? And so you need to walk outside. How do you develop software, right? So if you're in charge of that team, like, what is step one, right? And why is step one important? And so you go, okay, I got it. So you may not know how to do step one, right? You may not know how to evaluate step one, but you at least understand the rationale of why step one is important. So step one might be define requirements, right? So like, okay, well, as an engineer, like, why is that useful? If you don't get requirements written, what goes wrong in steps 2 and 3, right? If you do get requirements, what goes correctly in steps 2 and 3? How do you know if requirements are good or bad, right? So those are very general questions that can be applied to any technical field. So how do you evaluate, how do you determine a sales territory strategy, right? If you're managing a sales team, you have no sales experience. So how do you decide how big a territory should be? What is the trade-off? Why not have a lot of territories? Why not 100 territories rather than 2 territories? How do you decide? Right? So the questions tend to be either around decision-making processes or workflow processes. So if it's a decision-making process, like, how do you decide, right? What criteria are you using? What are your rules of thumb that you're considering that are implicit, that are so automatic? If it's a process, it's what are the steps? Why are the steps important? Why are the steps important in that particular sequence? Okay. So those are kind of the 2 lines of questioning, and it applies to, dealing with chief counsel on a legal matter, of which it could be dealing with the auditors, right, on some auditing compliance issue from new FASB ruling that just came out that has major implications for how you report your financials in a public company, that of which you personally have very little direct experience. So this problem exists a lot as you move more senior, and as you move laterally, and as you move to being more of a cross-functional leader, managing areas that you don't know. So process questions as well as decision-making questions. Those are the 2 sort of mental frameworks, if you would, in managing a field that you don't know personally very well. Did I answer your question? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
Yes, you did. So it's actually something I've tried to teach some of the founders I work with. But I think the process leaders is and you have a nice framework of that in your gravitas module. So
great.
It's one I've used. Thank you.
Good. And I would also do that with not just people who are more senior than you, but also people who report to you. And here's why. So one thing, I'll just share a quick story related, I think will be helpful. So I've done this, what I just told you to do, I've done this my whole career, because in consulting, I have no functional experience in any area with any of my clients. They all know more than I do, right? So, but yet I got a lot of credibility with them, in part taking something that I taught in the gravitas class, by asking them why certain things are the way they are. Right? So what would happen in consulting would be when I would go make a decision or make a recommendation to the CEO or the board, the CFO thought was great. Victor's involved. He's one of us finance guys, right? Because I spent so much time understanding the financial trade-offs of every possible decision. He felt very comfortable that I would consider the financial implications of any decision. Then I talked to the head of the call center, right, customer service. And like, oh, I'm so glad Vic was involved in this because he's one of us. He's one of our call center people. He understands all the issues that we face. The marketing person thought the same thing. The sales guy, we got a sales guy involved on the board there. Thankfully, we got someone who knows what they're talking about because he took the time to go understand it. So you win support and loyalty and respect when you take the time to understand something that's super detailed and you're doing it to genuinely learn and listen. People really appreciate that and makes you a smarter decision maker too.
Right.
Okay.
Great.
Good luck later. Take care, okay? All right, let's see. You got 15 minutes left. I got two or three more questions. I got a question from Australia, from Tianyit. Is that saying your name right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. How are you?
I'm good, Victor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm just conscious of time.
No problem.
5 years ago, I made the decision to leave my native country and living away from my parents just to pursue an MBA, which I achieved the goals I've set for myself, and I achieved the triple change, change of industry, change of function, and change of geographical location. Now, my question is, how do I choose between building a career in a foreign country and care for my aging parents back home? So it is not a business decision where it can be based solely on logical reasoning. It is a complex decision that involves lifestyle planning and responsibility, and I can't trade off any of those two. So what's your advice on that?
Sure. So let me give the sort of generic version of your question, right? Is you feel conflicted by a decision. This is a personal decision where you want two outcomes, but the two outcomes appear to be mutually exclusive, where you can't have both.
Correct. And I can't trade off any of those.
You can't trade off. Okay. So here is the issue. And I had the same conversation with a client this morning, right? Which is you have two priorities. One is family and the other is your career, right? Family's in one place geographically, career's in the other. And you're going to hate this answer because you already know the answer. You just don't like the answer. Is whenever there are priorities, I believe in what I call the force ranking of priorities, right? So my impression is your number one priority is family and career. And that's why you're having a difficulty making a choice because they are of equal importance. And if you do a force rank, you can only have one number one priority ever. And then you have one number two or one number three. Decision making is quite easy. If priority number one is your career, you know what to do. If priority number one is family, you know what to do, right? So the part you're not liking is the fact that you got to pick. And there is no magic formula to pick between two mutually exclusive options, right? What you can do is if you are clear on what is number one and what is number two, you can try to supplement, right? So for example, maybe you choose career first, right? Then you say, well, all my free time, I'm going back home to take care of my parents. Or I'm going to choose career. It earns a lot more money, so I can afford to support my parents by affording caregivers and others to help in that process or to do the majority of the work. Or you can say, family's number one, right? And I've decided that's the most important thing for me. I'm going to do that and recognize that I'm going to take a career hit, for several years, perhaps a decade or more, right? And I'm okay with that. But I've decided that there's only a certain window I have with them, right? So there's no right or wrong on that. The only wrong from a process standpoint is you haven't force ranked your priorities, and it makes it impossible to optimize. And there is no ideal solution. You're choosing between two core solutions, right? And nobody likes doing that, right? And you're basically trying to pick the slightly less worse. And the reality is there is no magic solution that gives you everything you want. And I'm sorry to say that, but I've been there, so it's very, very hard. And I can see that it's a struggle for you, as it would be for anybody.
Yeah, totally understood. So what I'm doing right now is, as per what you say, focus on the career first and think about how to strike a balance along the process. Or figure out a way.
Yeah, and it's easier to do that than to try to split it.
Yeah.
Because if you split it, you're not going to take care of your parents well, and you're not going to have much of a career. Then you're in the worst spot, right? Is you're away from your family, and you screwed up your career. You didn't help them, and you didn't help yourself. You helped nobody. And that's like the worst of all outcomes, right? If you focus on career, you do well, you have the resources, and you use your vacation time to go take care of them. It's not 100% solution on the parenting side or the family side, but it's better than zero, right? Or if you decide, I'm just going to be there with my family, and like I'm going to sacrifice a career, at least you got one of the two things done. You don't want is to screw up both of them. And that's the worst outcome possible. So I always say generically, pick one and then fill in the best you can within that constraint on number two is better than choosing nothing and having basically suboptimizing both.
Yep, got it, Victor. Better than zero.
Better than zero. Sorry, it's tough. I'm in the same situation. Most people, like most of my peers, we're all dealing with this of supporting family in some way or another, whether it's a medical issue or geographic. So I get it, and it's a tough one. And you're not alone. You're not alone in that. So there are a lot of people facing similar choices as you are.
Great to know. Thank you very much.
All right. Good luck with that. Tough one. Okay. Let's see. Last one or two questions, depending on time. These were questions that were submitted in writing. I have a question from, I think it's Zolo from Japan. And the question is, what's your approach for overcoming procrastination? Please share your views and best way to overcome it. So there's really two categories of approaches for dealing with procrastination. And I'll give you the two categories. And they're quite different. So category one is what I call the, to quote the Nike motto, just do it approach. And the just do it approach is, it doesn't matter if you got procrastination, you got to get it done. And the best way, best tool in that case is to have an external deadline, right? So I have a list of notes I had to prepare in order for our conversation today. And honestly, if we weren't scheduled to have this video conference, I probably wouldn't have looked at them last night or a couple of days ago in the first draft, and again this morning and last night. But because there's a deadline, I got to do it. The strategic outlier letter that you all write, as my staff will know because they're on this call, I turn it in like often the last hour before the deadline, in some cases 10 hours after the deadline. If there were no deadline, honestly, I probably wouldn't do it, right? Because it would be easier to always delay it a little bit more. But I've written, I don't know, 7, 8 years, I forget how many years worth of this newsletter because of the deadline. So that's sort of one school of thought. I have friends who are journalists and authors, and they'll say the difference between a professional writer and an amateur is the professional delivers because they have a deadline. Because if they don't deliver, they get fired. Super easy, super clear. So a deadline that's external, where you get embarrassed, you feel like you broke a commitment, are very strong and is usually one way to avoid procrastination. All right. The other approach is more of a psychological, approach. And it is thinking of procrastination as a sign that you have some unmet emotional need of some kind. Okay? So, for example, procrastination there might be a way of avoiding feelings, right? So maybe, I'm trying to think of a good example here. So maybe you started a business and you're procrastinating on writing a new business plan, right? In that example, an example of procrastination as a form of avoiding feelings would be that if you write the new business plan, you have to admit you failed in the last business, right? But if you don't write the new business plan, you can kind of sort of emotionally not to face the fact that you lost that, right? That would be an example of using procrastination as a way of avoiding a different feeling. In that case, basically, procrastination becomes the proxy for a different kind of feeling that you're trying to avoid having to face and deal with. A more gruesome example, might be, if you have a parent that has passed away and not clearing out their belongings, right, after they pass away, because it's a way of avoiding having to accept that they're gone, would be another more morbid or sad example. But again, procrastination is really a form of not dealing with some other feeling. It could be fear, it could be grief, it could be anxiety, whatever it might be. So what you want, the tool in that situation is to say, procrastination is not a problem. Procrastination is the solution you've chosen to deal with a different problem. And the question is to figure out, what problem am I solving by procrastinating? What do I get? What's my benefit? What's my payoff by procrastinating? And when you figure out, and it's usually some kind of emotionally based need of some sort, when you figure that out, the tool then becomes, how can I address that need in a different way other than using procrastination? So maybe, I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe my business failed and I'm procrastinating on writing a resume to get a job because I still have hope around that business. And as long as I don't write my new resume, I don't have to admit failure on my business, right? In that case, procrastinating serves me by avoiding having to accept failure, right? That being an example of procrastination as a solution to an emotional problem. So that's the other approach, is to try to figure out what is procrastination doing for me, and to figure out, is there another way to either meet that need, or oftentimes procrastination can sometimes be around loss. So there's a great framework for dealing with grief and loss. It's called the 5, it's by, I forget the name, Cantor, the 5 stages of grief. So if you Google that. And sometimes procrastination is a way to avoid having to grieve. At least that's been true in my case, in my life. So again, a way to avoid dealing with some other emotional issue that you really don't want to deal with and face. And so you can either face it or find an alternative approach to addressing that particular issue. All right, I'll do the last question here. This question is from Stella here in the United States. Question is, how do you develop gravitas with your boss's boss, right? And with other cross-functional leaders without offending your boss, who is new to their role and looking to establish themselves? For example, in Stella's case, or maybe it's a hypothetical case, you've noticed your boss taking credit for your work to demonstrate his or her own value to the people that you want to impress also. So this is a tricky one because there's a competing agenda to get attention. So it's sort of one of two things to look at in this situation in particular. One is, if your boss really wants to impress others, then you want to piggyback off of that need by figuring out some clever way of how you getting exposure to other executives really helps your boss get their own gravitas with other people. So that the general rule of thumb is figure out what your boss wants and help them get what they want in a way that also involves you getting what you want. Okay? So that's sort of like the common rule of thumb of what to do in any situation. Figure out what the other person wants and figure out a creative way to give them what they want in a way that gives you what you want also. In this particular situation, it's very difficult because they're also trying to establish themselves. And the question I have in my mind is does this boss back off of that, of taking credit once they're established and they feel more secure in their job, and allow you the room for you to shine as well? Or are they the kind of person that's so insecure they will never let you shine and will always take credit for your work because that's who they are, more as a personality trait rather than as a circumstance-driven behavior? So if they're the kind of person where they're doing it temporarily and as circumstances change, their behavior will change, maybe you wait them out to some extent. If they're never going to let you have any credit and never let you get any exposure to others, that's useful information too. And it may shift your willingness to stay in that role, working for that particular person for that particular amount of time. So that's a useful thing to figure out. I don't have a slam dunk or a 100% guaranteed approach for this particular instance, but those are the two ways of thinking about it that I would use in that situation. All right, so that'll wrap up our office hours for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I look forward to everyone joining us for our future office hours. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world. All right, thanks, bye.